Hey everyone, welcome back. Hystrix Prime is the successor to a much beloved weapon with a unique quirk. Khora, a fan favorite frame, just shipped her Prime with two signature weapons, Hystrix and Dual Carries Prime. Dual Carries, even non-Prime, were revered due to their sky-high disposition, closing the gap and allowing a mid/weighted weapon to truly rival the rest of the pack. While the priming of the melee resulted in an exemplary weapon that competes with the best, I cannot say the same with the Hystrix Prime. There were many things wished for on Hystrix's priming, namely a larger magazine, better reload, more balanced hybrid stats, better ammo economy perks like the Magnus, better scaling on the unique perk. There were really a million things that they could have done. And what did we get? The Hystrix Prime has 4% more crit chance, 10% more status, and 6 more base damage, or a 15% raw damage increase. While this certainly makes the weapon hit harder and makes it notably stronger, it does not fix the issues of the weapon it previously had. Reload speed was buffed by 0.1 seconds, or literally inconsequential. Before accounting for fire rate buffs, which is extremely common through frame buffs, arcane velocity, or lethal torrent, this weapon only has a 58.8% DPS uptime, meaning you spend 41.2% of the time reloading. It does not feel good. Some weapons this is okay on because whether they have AoE, with some options like Kuvazar being meta despite spending most of the time reloading, or a weapon like Phantasma or Kuvahek, which all have excessive single target damage. Hystrix has none of this. No innate punch through, no AoE, no excessively high damage. It is a prime, pun intended, example of the current problem with single target meta, where even if the stats on the paper appear desirable, the performance is lacking. This weapon would have been infinitely better if it had some innate punch through. Due to build problems you will soon notice, the weapon stats are intentionally skewed lower at a raw 322 damage per second before crits, because it is highlighted by the unique Quills mechanic. Hystrix Prime also has a signature perk that grants an 8% chance to fully reload the magazine instantly on headshots. Each multi-shot is considered a separate chance to roll this perk, but this perk is only active on Khora herself, so treat it a bit like a Magnus Prime or less related Nell Prime, but only on her. Honestly, the result of this passive is that the weapon only feels nice to use on Khora. A weapon should not be forced to require energized munitions or pistolier to function in a half-decent capacity in the current state of weapon balance. Hystrix Prime retains the ability to freely select between one of the 4 elemental quill types with the on-fire button rotating through Toxin, Heat, Electric, and Cold. Selecting any of the quills results in all shots force proccing that element on hit with 1 proc per multi-shot. However, the shot inflicts 0 damage of that elemental type, only providing a proc. This is proven by doing 0 damage to Prophet Taker shields naturally, as shown here with heat quills against the Heat Prophet Taker shield. This is actually a problem. The weapon itself does not gain any elemental weighting to the chosen damage type. Not only does the weapon's raw base damage remain low in exchange for a proc, but the elemental proc also has 0% elemental mods to skill off of, meaning it will barely do any damage unless you mod on said element. While this is beneficial to help the force proc scale, this partially defeats the purpose of force procs as a form of DPS, since this means the Hystrix will perform no different than an unnerfed weapon, with normal base damage that just reaches 100% status and using mods weighted towards heat. This is further compounded by the problem that secondaries in general are even more slot-starved than primaries and also have mod capacity problems even if you forma every single slot. You just cannot fit enough mods on to make the Hystrix to perform optimally. There is a way around this though, but I will save that for more eccentric builds later on. Let's look at the 2 most popular Hystrix setups right now. Corrosive Heat, a raw damage focused build, and Viral Heat, a damage over time focused build. Corrosive first. Do know that I have polarity problems on this build, and as a result, I'm using Pistol Pestilence instead of Pathogen rounds. This represents only about a 15% loss in total DPS, meaning you should still be able to extrapolate how well this performs. Basically, you are not relying on the force procs to deal damage. You do not need to worry about the heat proc scaling. It is only functioning as a form of crowd control, while also temporarily armor stripping beyond what corrosive procs can do. Any extra damage from the heat procs is a bonus. However, the weapon still suffers as a result from abnormally low raw damage. It takes about half the magazine to kill a level 165 corrupted heavy gunner, which means I need to reload every 2 heavy kills. While this does not represent every unit in a base steel path mission, it is very easy to overcommit bullets, since Hystrix Prime is a full auto weapon. The weapon also has 1.6 seconds reload, which is actually only brought down to 1.23 seconds as the arsenal does round, but the weapon does not when you're actually using it. A weapon that reloads this often as full auto should only have a base 1 second reload speed in my opinion, with the Pandero Prime family being the closest example. We have specifically chosen not to mod for fire rate to improve handling. It does not have the magazine size to justify it, and Seeker is sorely needed for punch through to compensate the lackluster single target damage. The rest of the build includes standard crits, multi-shot, Guncio, Prime Banes for 1.55 times more damage since raw damage only dips once, and ammo mutation since this is a bullet hose. Secondary Merciless is extremely important to bolster the damage of this weapon. Optionally, you can try out Deadhead, but I really felt the 1.6 base reload of the weapon was a very noticeable detriment to the experience. With the punch through, you can actually kill enemies in a somewhat decent time frame. However, you have less base damage than a typical weapon, a tiny magazine, and the unique Quills perk is relegated to just crowd control and some armor strip. For perspective, a lot of people who swear about the meta but like shiny new toys have a habit of dumping on my Tenet Spirix and Daiku setups for some reason. In fact, let me show you the Cynex. Cynex is a weapon I've chosen not to cover in the past because it did not reach a kill efficiency I deemed worth covering. Everybody knows about the Magnetized Cynex, and by extension, Zada's Whisper Cynex isn't that different. I was curious how this weapon performed by itself, or with ensnare setups. This is an Arcane Avengers Cynex because it was the only way to boost the damage high enough to be worth using without bullet attractor setups. If I ensnare these targets, I can just barely kill all of them with one fan of the own fire. Just barely, and it's iffy. This is why I never actually covered the weapon, as the kill threshold is borderline. Compare this to my Gas Tenet Spirix video from earlier this year with this build. It can kill all 20 corrupted heavy gunners in 4 shots. This is a setup to sacrifice his single target damage because the Spirix already does enough to turn it into an actually functioning AoE weapon. It definitely surpasses the Cynex, and this is the reason why I covered the gas build. Then we have my AoE Daiku I know some people also dismiss. Both the Spirix and Daiku were meant to be used with a melee status primer, but I skipped that for this showcase today. Even the AoE gas Daiku can kill this whole crowd in about 3 or 4 shots without priming. This is the main reason why I'm disappointed with the Hystrix Prime, as it falls so far behind alternative weapon options that others have discarded due to not conforming to the meta. If even off-meta gas setups outdamage the Hystrix, where exactly does it put our shiny new toy in the power rankings? Also, as a reminder, I said that the VERICRES was good, albeit worse than the Gunson, and that's also slightly worse than the Cronin Prime family and the Praetos. Just keep in mind how fast the VERICRES kills here compared to the Hystrix I showed earlier, even if I replace Condition Overload for a Prime Pressure Point and don't prime my enemies. The second build I'm going to show you today is a Viral Heat Hystrix setup. This also works for electric quills, which I would recommend only on Khora with ensnare, because electric quills can chain heads with the dot, resulting in quasi-infinite ammo that pulls from your reserves. This is a dot build also, meaning that the primed expel is super important since it will multiply your damage by 2.4 times. The only thing that has changed compared to a Corrosive build are the elemental mods. This actually highlights the problem of the Hystrix itself. Remember how I said the Quills only provide a status proc and do no actual damage of the corresponding elements, nor have any elemental damage innately to scale off of outside of the weapon's own base damage. This makes the heat procs on Hystrix extremely weak. There are only 2 ways to fix this. Either you need to drop Seeker to fit Primed Heat to charge, which massively nerfs the weapon's crown killing potential, since you now do 2.65 times more damage on heat procs while adding a few natural procs as well, but can only hit 1 enemy at a time. Or you are forced to use Ember for Fireball Frenzy, or Frame with Gauss's Thermal Transfer heat buff subsumed to add heat to the weapon externally. Whichever method you pick, you're either giving up scaling damage potential, punch through, Warframe choice, or Helminth choice. There is no true solution to fix Hystrix to work optimally on every frame. This is reflected in the damage showcase, where even using the unique Quills mechanic for damage still results in lackluster damage scaling against these enemies. The TTK is comparable to the Corrosive build from earlier and still weaker than the Cynex, Gas Spirix, and Gas Daiku setup. Even without grouping, it still takes too many shots out of the magazine to kill them and causes excessive reloading. Because of all the mods we need on a traditional damage setup, we also do not have enough space to slot reload mods or magazine mods. That would result in us both losing heat dot scaling and also punch through, leading to abysmal clear potential. There was also an innovative cold quill setup I was testing that looked similar to the previous builds. Essentially, I used the non-galvanized versions of mods, dropped the crit mods to make radiation, and replaced the Bane with the lethal torrents. Also, Ice Storm instead of the 60-60 cold mod. This results in 22 ammo per magazine for a better primer experience. You can very easily spread radiation, cold, and viral through crowns this way, essentially working like a punch-through epitaph. But the lack of AoE results in lack of consistency, and perhaps more dangerous is not the weapon's lack of AoE, but single target with punch through, resulting in you assuming everything is CC'd when all it takes is one enemy that isn't, to shoot you up and kill you off in Steel Path. So while this may sound like an interesting idea for extra cold procs alongside the typical viral and radiation, I would not recommend it. Even in Disruption, this weapon's inability to consistently deal with crowds mean I would rather use Compressor to prime trash mods if I wasn't using Epitaph. Speaking of Disruption, we also have two alternative Steel Path Demolist focused setups, a Toxin Quill Expedite Suffering setup, and a Heat Inherit setup. They're unique for very different reasons. The Toxin Quill setup uses the Force procs to bolster the damage against Demolists, since this means we can skip building for status. Pathogen Round serves to boost our Toxin procs here, multiplying them by 1.9 times damage, and adding some extra Toxin weight for natural procs, resulting in over 2 times final damage increase. Prime Quick Draw massively improves weapon handling, since you will most likely have to dump more than one magazine for Endurance Steel Path demos along the line, the further you go. Pistol Ammo Mutation makes up for the massive ammo drain, albeit you should probably be using a separate weapon to deal with trash mobs. We are taking secondary Merciless, since a lot of the kills can and will come from dots. Alternatively, you can slot Deadhead if you so choose, if you are armor stripping, but this time it is a bit more of a personal choice, since you will lose Merciless stacks while heading to Demless, but that would allow you to keep the bonus reload speed. You would normally pair this with a Vastlock on an armor strip build that can also have viral built into it. This is a slightly different build than normal, since I intend to bring a primary trash clear weapon and thus need to compress viral primer and armor stripper into my gunblade. It takes on average 55 combo, or 3.5 cycles of alternating neutral and forward melee to stack 10 viral procs on the demo. This is enough to strip off about 648 baseline armor if you land every shot, so every single demolish should be full strip by the time you reach 10 viral stacks. You're also highly likely to produce slash and impact procs, resulting in 3 procs for gun CO on Hystrix before accounting for Hystrix's own procs. Lasting Sting extends those procs to 12.6 seconds, which should be more than enough time to kill the demo. Any frame with Expedite Suffering works for this, and as a result, I will showcase a Saryn without her other abilities first. I won't armor strip from the Dracar since Expedite setups are so strong, I will be unable to show the damage if I do so. Essentially, build up your Merciless or whatever weapon arcane stacks. Normally you would strip the demo armor, then shoot the head with Hystrix and cast Expedite. Magus Lockdown will help to keep them in place. Notice how much health I shred off. Imagine if this was actually unarmored. Saryn's Expedite Suffering setup can run like this. Just keep in mind Saryn Disruption setups are very easy to die on since their defense is their strongest offense in killing everything, and you'll be using molds to get all your shields back. Essentially, cast Venom Dose and Toxin Lash, unload on the Demolist, and cast Expedite. The Force procs on Toxin Lash on every damage instance literally doubles the amount of procs inflicted, as well as boosting the damage of each hit further. Venom Dose will add more raw damage to kill trash mobs while also boosting Toxin Lash scaling as well. You want to keep neutral range so that the Expedite can actually hit the Demolist from outside its nullifying pulse aura that has 6-meter radius. The final build, as I mentioned, is Heat Inherit. This is actually perfect synergy to work around the biggest drawbacks of Hystrix. It's a lack of scaling on dots unless you build for it, and a lack of proper damage scaling, and thus inability to deal with crowds properly. The principle of Heat Inherit works like this. You use the percent mod heat of the first heat proc for all future heat procs, but you use the base damage, crits, multi-shots of the current DPS weapon to scale into future procs. This means you can offload a super high amount of heat mods onto your primer, freeing up slots on the DPS weapon to fit more crit, fire rate, and other damage modifiers. And you remember how dot builds double dip banes? In Heat Inherit builds, the damage dips 1 bane from the primer and 1 from your DPS weapon, meaning the primer also needs a bane. Therefore, you would need a primary Heat Inherit primer that looks like this. I chose Bubonico just because of ease of priming. It has innate viral, and you can add corrosive and heat onto this to prime alongside viral, and Hunter Track to extend procs to 7.8 seconds. Heat also inherits the status duration of the first proc, so all refreshes, even with a different weapon, will last 7.8 seconds, which results in 1 extra heat take of damage before expiring. Then we have our Bane and Holster Speed Excellus alongside Dexterity. This should be max rank, but polarity problems. This Bubonico has 210% heat, which will be passed on to all damage of our Hystrix Prime, which is perfect since the natural force procs are considered 0% heat and only scale off of the weapon's innate damage. The Heat Inherit Heat Quill build looks like this. It's extremely similar to the Toxin Expedite setup, however we dropped the 90% Toxin mod for hydraulic crosshairs. This is because we already have force heat procs and the status on the weapon is too low to make it worth adding heat onto the weapon itself. Additionally, because Heat Inherit uses the heat percent of the primer and not Hystrix, this means there's no way to increase the damage of a dot by modding heat on Hystrix. I have chosen Hydraulic Crosshairs and Primed Quick Draw because this results in the highest DPS, assuming one magazine is not enough to kill the Demolist. The rough comparisons of the 8th slot are as follows. Prime Heated Charge only grants 22% more damage. Hornet Strike, assuming force status is present for Guncio, only grants 20% more damage. Prime Magazine is a 33.3% damage increase, whereas Prime Quick Draw is a 39% damage increase. Cascadia Flare is better than Merciless here, even if I use Prime Magazine instead of Primed Reload, which would dilute Merciless's reload buff otherwise. Though if you are using this Heat Inherit setup on Khora with Roar, then the infinite reload from headshots will make Prime Quick Draw or Prime Slip Magazine irrelevant, making Prime Heated Charge the best alternative mod. Cascadia Flare also has the benefit of scaling off heat procs and not kills, meaning you do not need to kill enemies in advance before heading off to kill the Demolist. The Heat Inherit setup is arguably easier to set up than the Toxin build because of Cascadia Flare and higher damage ceiling with infinite scaling. You do not need to reapply damage if Expedite doesn't kill, since you don't cast any abilities to nuke and remove procs. However, because you spend a slot on Bubonico as a primer, Hystrix to kill Demolists, and Vastlot to strip armor, you do not have a purpose-built weapon to deal with trash mobs like the Toxin Expedite loadout. This is a much more Demolist-focused setup. You would use the same Vastlot build as I showcased earlier, however I would recommend dropping Sacrificial Steel, which is normally used to proc arcanes that need crits while you're armor stripping the Demolist. You would instead run Molten Impact to refresh heat procs. Essentially, you prime the Demolist first, then you armor strip with Vastlot while refreshing heat, then you shoot the head with Hystrix. Mag's Lockdown once again will be super helpful in keeping the Demolist in place. If you want the maximum damage output that surpasses all else, then I guess you can use a Ember build like this with Roar. Just keep in mind it is a bit difficult to survive on, and you do not need to use Ember. Roar on any frame will get the job done easily, and I wasn't even using Roar in the showcase earlier. And there you go, all the builds for Hystrix Prime in one place. This weapon is a slight disappointment in my eyes for normal trash mobbing, as it is intentionally nerfed to account for its unique Quill mechanic. It does not have enough mod slots available to make up for the lackluster base damage, lack of punch through, lack of force proc scaling, and unnecessarily small magazine paired with a longer reload. However, Demolist focused setups do allow it to shine through loadouts that specifically allow you to save mod slots through pure Toxin or take maximal advantage of force procs via Expedite Suffering and Heat Inherit, or offload heat dot scaling by Heat Inherit primers. It honestly only feels like a true weapon in its own right on Khora. I wish for more from this, but I hope others can still enjoy the Hystrix Prime for what it is. Cheers! If this is your first time watching, feel free to leave a like or, better yet, subscribe. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. 79.5% of you are not subscribed. I'm trying my best to get you new information out always as soon as possible, like I've done with covering the new Echoes of Zeraman updates, TennoCon, and Khora Prime's loadouts. Stick around if you want to see interesting memes and builds on a nearly daily basis. You don't want to miss out on any of that, do you? That'll be it for this video. Thank you all for watching, and see you all next time.